Hey.
Good. All right,
how are
we're
you?
recording. I'm good. How are you, Eli?
We are recording. Okay, I want to introduce everybody. I'm Eli Lake from now a newspaper that will be named later, and the New Republic, and this is Chris Hayes of The Nation. And this is a special episode of Blogging Heads, and I've got some theme music here in the background, a little Kenny Loggins, if that's not what you're looking for. Because this is all about the Obama appointments and the progressives. So I thought that would be an appropriate theme song. And I also have a prop, Christopher Hayes.
You're going to have to describe it, obviously.
I have a prop which I have to describe, which is a bowl of popcorn. So for this, I'm going to be, I've got some popcorn for the upcoming battle royale between the African-American president-elect and the left.
Well, okay, so that's fascinating that you say that, because just to dive right into this topic of the relationship of, well, broadly of the left to Obama, but more specifically how the left, to the degree that you can generalize about the left, is viewing his personnel choices thus far. One of the things that's really interested me is that I wrote a blog post, just sort of noting and obviously complaining about the fact that there were no,
dyed in the wool progressives.
That's right, dyed in the wool progressives. No real sort of real kind of out lefties, let's say.
Yes.
In the cabinet or being floated for positions. Since then, I think a few who fit that description, Melody Barnes most notably, who's going to be head of the Domestic Policy Council, have been named. But it was really funny to me because this post, which I didn't really, I wrote it.
You launched 1,000 columns.
Yeah, it for some reason it just got picked up everywhere, particularly that phrase. And I've been thinking about why it got so sort of circulated, and that complaint got so circulated. And part of the reason is I think there's a spectrum of interests that are anxiously awaiting a kind of left Obama battle. So there's right now, I think the sort of DC Beltway establishment, the way that it works is that they want to claim Obama as their own because he's very popular, and so there's a sort of political capital that comes associationally. So the establishment wants to kind of claim him as a sort of establishment centrist figure, and so they're anxious to see kind of left Obama riffs. The right doesn't like the left, and out of a kind of Schadenfreude, out of A, a kind of Schadenfreude, and B, a kind of desire to see, because they don't want to see a left agenda enacted, also want to see a left Obama fight. And then the left itself, particularly the members of whom were constantly kind of warning through the primary period, this guy's a centrist, we shouldn't trust him, we shouldn't fall in love with him, they want to see that fight also. So all of these have lined up, and in fact, blogs and columnists of all three categories were the ones that kind of picked up the column. So it's interesting to me because I think there's a high degree of interest in this battle happening.
Well, let's look at the evidence. First of all, Chairman Lieberman. Say it loud, say it proud. It's Chairman Joe Lieberman. Jane Hampshire, on her blog, went so far as to say this is what the Democratic Party thinks of you, reminding me of the intro to one of the Re-Up Gang records. Then there's, Bob Gates, who, I would say, neoconservatives and conservatives really like Bob Gates right now. He has been an advocate in front of Congress of the surge on Iraq, and obviously he was picked by Bush. The more and more there's more of a consensus. There's very few holdouts who think that Rumsfeld was good. So Gates is sort of the de facto guy that has been endorsed at least by the right. Hillary Clinton, who was pilloried and skewered in the primary by progressives for supporting punitive actions against Iran.
And by Obama, we should note.
And by Obama, right, exactly. But I'm saying, Hillary, who has been, who never apologized for her war vote, and, I can attack her from the right on the war stuff, but saying clearly kind of was positioned in the primaries more. And then, Jim Jones, who ironically will actually be probably the advocate for Palestinian nationalism, I think, within the administration. I will have a link to it in my piece. But I think on other issues, former Marine Commandant, former Supreme Commander of NATO, and somebody who warned against setting arbitrary deadlines for the withdrawal of Iraq. Those are your big three in national security. There was a minor victory, I guess, because John Brennan, the original choice for CIA, I guess had to withdraw.
Right.
But Spencer Ackerman, who's by no means a moderate on these issues, pointed out that Brennan really, you couldn't point to anything really with Brennan. Brennan really wasn't much of a kind of like a Cofer Black when it came to torture issues. And he actually wrote he thought it was a little bit unfair that he was sort of pressured out of that post. So those are your big cabinet, at least on national security issues. And then, Geithner on the New York Fed Reserve Chairman for Treasury, and Summers for Council of Economic Advisors. Those are centrists. I mean, I guess those are centrists. I wouldn't even call them center-left, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would, yes, that's right. I mean...
So maybe there'll be a progressive administrator for Veterans Affairs.
Right, yeah, that's right. Dude, we're totally going to get the education department. You guys are going to get the education department. We will own education.
I think there's going to be a progressive in charge of the fisheries committee.
Yes, that's right.
Right. No, I mean, I don't want to, obviously, I think it's a little bit overplayed a little bit, and I was joking about the popcorn, but it seems that Obama's kind of gone out of his way to say to establishment Washington, hey, I get it.
Yes, that's right, yeah. No, that exactly, I think that, what you just said is the takeaway above and beyond anything else. I mean, there is, look, if you compare, let me sort of make 2 points. First of all, I think that I agree that at a certain point, there is a trend here, and all the instances that you've noted, I think, amount to something. I would say that there are varying degrees within this category of instances of courting the establishment, putting a centrist foot forward. I think, for instance, the Lieberman thing, I thought he should have gotten stripped of the chairmanship just because, I think you shouldn't reward bad behavior. But I also think that was, in some ways, sort of incidental, and I can understand making the exact same political capital calculation.
I'm reminded of the Tom Petty lyric, even the losers get lucky.
That's right, yeah, exactly. I mean, in some ways, going after Lieberman is kind of punching down, I mean, I think Lieberman is what he is at this point, which is, I think, a figure with not a tremendous amount of political capital or stature. And
he won his election in Connecticut.
Well, he did. I mean, that was a few years ago, though. And I mean, it's kind of fascinating. He has a similar trajectory to Bush, who, pretty much as soon as Bush was reelected, his approval ratings went below 50%. Lieberman is the same way. Basically, he was reelected, and then immediately his approval ratings have kind of fallen into the basement. So,
well, but the interesting thing about Lieberman is that he is an economic liberal of clearly somebody who is going to support what will be a new economic stimulus package, more infrastructure investment. So on a lot of issues that you care about that I would probably disagree with, Lieberman's your guy. On the war, where it really mattered in 2007, I think there's a consensus. I don't think that there's going to be much of a debate right now on the timeline for withdrawal or the fact that I think in the end there will be still American troops and American bases in Iraq after 2011. Right. We can get into that later, but I don't think that Lieberman's voice on that one way or the other is going to fix it. And then, Lieberman has an issue with violent video games, which, from my perspective, whatever.
Well, every senator has their, has sort of...
Right, but I'm just saying, I guess you could say, he's kind of a moralist, he's a little bit preachy, but on most issues on the Democratic agenda, if you take out the Iraq War, Lieberman is right there with you. He's there with you on environment. He's there with you on economic initiatives.
Yeah,
he's there with you.
I think that's an overly narrow, I think, interpretation of what a senator does and its relationship to the party. I mean, the guy was giving. We've now learned that he was giving donations to Republican candidates running against Democrats. I mean, look. At a certain point, you are a member of a party, and that means something, and it means certain things that go above and beyond, where you're rated by Planned Parenthood or League of Conservation Voters. I mean, if you go around talking about how awful Democrats are, there's got to be. Look, I expended very, very little energy on Lieberman, and I think that all in all, however it sort of resolved itself, it was best to sort of just get it resolved. I think the other stuff is much more. I actually think the biggest issue here of all the ones you note is Hillary Clinton in some ways, and the reason is that Jonah Goldberg had actually a pretty smart blog post on this where he said, look, Barack Obama ran largely in the primary on an argument that Hillary Clinton's judgment was so lacking on foreign policy that you should not vote for her for president. So, to then turn around and say, this is the person who I want to execute my foreign policy, the same person who I argued was so deeply lacking specifically in foreign policy judgment. It either, what are we to conclude other than that he actually didn't believe that then? Which is possible. I mean, look, primaries are opportunistic affairs and you sort of look for daylight where you can. Or he believed it then and thinks that, she can be brought into his broad framework. And indeed, I think that the story that's in the Times today, which talks about how, clearly is being leaked by the transition team, talking about how, there's an unnamed foreign policy advisor talking about how this group, Jones, Gates, and Clinton, are sort of on board, even though, it looks like they're kind of hawkish posse, they're on board for this sort of recalibration of American foreign policy priorities, away from brute strength, force, militarism, and towards soft power diplomacy, etc. I don't know if that's true, but clearly I think that the placement of that article suggests that they're worried a little bit about their left flank.
Well, yeah, but I think that the left flank is going to be in many ways treated the way evangelicals under Reagan were treated in some ways. That I think there's going to be speeches that are going to make your heart sing, or neoconservatives under Bush's second term, where he's going to give you symbolic victories and then substantively kind of go in a direction. I mean, that's my sense of it. I mean, we never know. The thing to keep in mind is a big caveat here, which is that us in the media business, we make a living out of trying to predict the future based on these appointments. But, the president's going to have to react to the world. And there will sometimes be something that does not fit into an ideological... You know what I'm saying? Like
Plus,
there could
be the other thing to think about is the fact that even though Rumsfeld and Cheney, among people in the know, had sort of neoconservative leanings, inclinations when, put into the vice presidency and DOD, it wasn't like, I noted this on my blog. It wasn't like, people were like, oh, it's all these like Ford administration retreads. Like clearly they're going to like launch a global campaign of preemptive war. It wasn't.
I think that really the way to look at that is not an ideological question, which I think people get tripped up on. It was a reaction to 9/11, an overreaction to 9/11, but a reaction to 9/11. The policy before 9/11 for the Bush administration was, we're not the world's 911. We're against nation building.
Right.
We want to strengthen our alliances with Russia and great powers. Right. It was completely different than what happened afterwards, where Bush sort of looked around the room and he said, the consensus policy on the Middle East in particular has gotten me 9/11.
Right. But there were people within the orbit who were advocating something much more like the post 9/11 policy before 9/11.
Well,
it's just that they got listened to.
Well, there were advocates for. I mean, I don't want to get too into the weeds of this, but I know a lot about this. But there were advocates for, enacting the Iraq Liberation Act, which is very different than invading Iraq. If you understand what I'm saying, that was arming an Iraqi opposition, and in retrospect, actually, that probably would have been the right move. But there were views of like what was the best way to get rid of Saddam on the sort of secret side, but then it became a higher priority after 9/11, just because there was a new calibration of threats and the risk. I think that you're seeing through kind of erosion of that, especially in Bush's second term, dialing back of that view of the threat. Clearly, or at least I don't know anybody who wants to invade Iran or invade Syria on the right. It's obvious that we don't have the troops to do that. So there's kind of there's beginning to be a national security consensus, which probably would make partisans of whether left or right unhappy in certain degrees. But it's not. I don't. It's a little bit of hard power covertly, a little bit of soft
Right.
power overtly. It's a combination of things, and it looks like Obama does not have a particular detailed plan that would go against the emerging consensus, which is probably exemplified by Bob Gates. You know what I'm saying? So he does what he does. You know what I'm saying? So he's going to go with, I think, the conventional wisdom at this point.
Yeah.
And then there could very well be another Mumbai.
Right.
There could be another terrorist attack, or there could be, I don't know, he could do a review of the black sites in Europe or something that would change his mind. There could be a political crisis or something like that, and he would react to that.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying about, one of the things that's, I think, depressing from my perspective in terms of foreign policy is that I'm trying to think about how best to articulate this, because this is not, I'm not an expert in foreign policy by any means. So, one of the things that's interesting is I think that, I think it's fair to say that kind of the problems caused by the Bush administration foreign policy have led to a real kind of re-embrace of sort of George H.W. Bush vintage Scowcroftian realism, let's say.
In a way, yes.
Yeah,
sadly.
and I think that's, and it's like, it's sort of, from my left perspective, it's sort of like, well, we're kind of all coalescing around sort of like more competent, smarter, less nutty imperial management.
Thank you. Yes. I've been waiting for progressives to say this for years.
And that's not really sufficient at all. It's...
No, if you're a progressive, you've got to have a different view. Scowcroft should be the enemy.
Yeah, right. And it's superior.
Right.
It is superior. The fact of the matter is, yes, it's superior to what we've had. it's superior to, I think, it's superior to neoconservatism. So, in that sense, that's...
I think the left. I think liberals should have gotten behind the neoconservative faction in the administration, and not linked themselves when they were out of power to Powell and Armitage.
Right.
Because neoconservatives I think at this point, I'm chastened, so I don't believe anymore that we can invade countries, and I was never really into invading. I just thought. It was sort of there was an invasion that was planned, but. Invasions are out, but then the notion that... Well, no, I'm just saying...
No, that's a great quote. That's... I hope that's true.
I'm saying that the neoconservatives were the one who challenged the idea that our stability was linked up in our alliances with these Mukhabarats and security services.
Right.
And I still think that that's true. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan has not bought us more security by pursuing a policy that was entirely based on a relationship at the top levels with the army and the ISI.
Right.
Instead, what we get is Al-Qaeda-stan. And we can see that the trajectory of a kind of traditional empire management, as you point out, I like that, imperial management, is not any. I think at the end of the day, neoconservatives and liberals in particular, I would make a distinction between neoconservatives, obviously. I wouldn't say that liberals and the left. Like liberal internationalists, it depends on where you fall on this, but...
Right.
The fact that neoconservatives would like, at the end of the day, successive elections, rule of law, respect for human rights in the Middle East and other third world countries, that's at least a goal that would be shared by progressives, right?
Well, sure.
But what more importantly, the neoconservative insight, and I think that progressives hopefully would agree with this, or they should have agreed with this, is that a democratization of the Middle East is necessary for the stability that is always on offer from the Scowcroft, Baker, Hamilton wing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but this is a little...
That if you want that stability, you don't get it through dictatorship.
Yeah, but I think we're watering down now to the point where, it's a little like saying, Stalin's goal was the broadly shared, gains from the bounty of Russia, and everyone could agree with that. I mean, implementation matters a tremendous amount, and means. I mean, there's a distinction here between means and ends, and I think that, like, yes, in the abstract, sure, progressives. I'll speak for myself. Sure, yeah, I want to see civil society, checks and balances, free and fair elections,
right. You
parties.
make a very good point. That progressives don't like any wars, and they want the UN Security Council to be the final arbiter of U.S. foreign policy actions or military actions in that regard. That's a big difference between conservatives who think that the international system is broken.
Right.
But the notion that, at least the argument that our stability is wrapped up in the freedoms and aspirations of third world peoples, and that we cannot count on dictatorships providing stability and national security for us in the long run, should be a left-right. Neocon progressive
but
agree on that.
Okay, but the neocons have made assent to that premise toxic.
What?
I mean, they have set back, because assent to that premise has this, that was the opening argument of some of the most disastrous foreign policy choices and policies, in recent memory. So it's very difficult to say, well, yes, in this sort of abstract, sort of principled philosophical way, I agree with, baseline premise number one about the sort of inability to disengage fundamentally our security from the rights, freedoms, and quality of life of the people, in everywhere from Hebron to Karachi, to Congo. Which, yes, I agree with. I mean, I think that's generally a sort of globally humanist.
You don't like starting wars.
I don't like war. I hate war.
You don't like war.
I hate war. I mean,
you hate war. I get that.
Yeah, I mean, but
and by the way, I don't. It's like it's just like nobody likes war.
Right. Well, sure. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying like the notion that like there's a pro-war group is kind of. I mean, that's a straw man. I mean, nobody out there like sort of likes war. I suppose you could say there are armament industries which are non-ideological that like war.
Right.
I guess you could say yes. The makers of Humvees and missiles
Kevlar,
like war, or maybe they profit from war, but I mean I don't know. I don't think I think we're seeing now with Iraq a much better outcome than even I would say, and I was always more optimistic on this than like 2 years ago, and I think we could see in Iraq in some ways. I mean, there are three national elections scheduled next year in Iraq. The Shia majority party is sufficiently now done enough things that I think kind of show that they're independent from Iran, which is a big deal. We might be looking, and we're going to have an alliance with the Iraqi military that's going to be better than any alliance we have with any other military, and it's going to be at a lower level and a mid-level, not just the top level.
Right.
And we managed to, in partnership with the Iraqi military, defeat the people who sought civil war. So I think that there's going to be a revisionism on Iraq, probably starting under Obama. And it will. And we said in our last dialogue, I don't think that the left is going to focus on Iraq and having all troops out of Iraq at a certain date, the way they did 2 years ago.
Well, part of that I think is just because of the increased salience of domestic concerns. I mean, I think it's, yes. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the economic situation that we're already going into and entering into is going to be so immediate in I think the broad majority of Americans' lives that it's really going to crowd out a lot of stuff. I mean, and it's going to produce tremendous political space, as long as there's not a ton of Americans dying somewhere in the world. Barack Obama's going to have the political space to do just about whatever he wants, I think, abroad.
It just seems like his inclinations to do what he wants abroad is basically to enact what is now becoming a kind of policy consensus on these things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, unfortunately.
But I don't know. I don't necessarily. I mean, I think that in some cases that's going to mean I wrote this big article. I don't think in some cases that's going to mean alliances with security services, which kind of are in the end are not good for the broader goal of sort of democratization. But in some cases, it's going to mean I mean, I think that there is a consensus emerging, and I hope that Obama would follow that. That it's worth nurturing a long-term relationship with Iraq. That at least their military and other elements of their society clearly want. The Kurds want, the Sunnis want. And in the end, I think Iraq is going to be a wholly different category of ally than we have in a country like Saudi Arabia or Jordan. I've been of the view that our alliances in the Arab and Islamic world are like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt are illusory. Like, I don't think that they're going to last in the long term, just because they're built. I mean, I lived in Egypt, and
right.
they're built on these very corrupt and unfree systems, and eventually they can't sustain. I think Iraq, in the end, since it's kind of gotten through this awful, I mean, it could have. There's still lots of risks. I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it, but Iraq it looked sort of emerging out of what could have been this awful civil war, and it's sort of emerging out of that, and the forces that wanted the civil war are defeated. I think that Iraq can be a categorically different kind of ally to America in the region, and one that we really haven't seen before.
Well, I mean, I certainly hope that Iraq is really a peaceful, functioning, stable democracy. I hope that the 1.5 million refugees who are now...
Well, they've been returning,
Yeah,
they've been returning
very
steadily.
slowly, though. I mean...
No, well, but they have been returning, though, and because
Right.
the neighborhoods have gotten better, the statistics are that they've been
Right.
returning. Some of it's, because the Syrians kicked them out,
Right.
But slowly but surely.
Yeah. So and I think, look, to me, as sort of just a principle of just as a basic sort of first principle thing, I don't think we should be occupying Iraq, and I think that whatever consensus, I mean, there's a consensus now that's the case. I mean, that's essentially the contours of the status of forces agreement. It's the contours of both, I think, where Gates and Obama are. I think, I also think we shouldn't have permanent bases there. In fact, I believe strongly in that.
Why would you be against, I don't think we should have permanent bases that would be against the will of the Iraqi people.
Right.
My understanding of the SOFA, and you can read about this in the New Republic coming up, but my understanding of the SOFA is that the basis will be negotiated with provincial authorities and this commission, and in some cases, like in Al-Assad and in the Kurdish regions, the local government, and it's a very federalist country, want American bases there for a while. In other situations, they don't.
Right.
We have bases in Okinawa. We don't call that an occupation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have bases, I think, in 172 countries. Is that right? 170?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And largely, what are our bases there for? We're not there to exploit the masses. We're there to protect free trade, usually in the shipping lanes.
Sure.
And we're there usually to kind of keep a general peace. We're there in Korea, for example, South Korea, because we don't want the communist and aggressive North Koreans to, have a reprise of what they tried to do and unify the peninsula under, North Korean rule. We're there, so we were in Germany or in West Germany for years because we wanted to have a kind of bulwark against
Sure. No,
Soviet
I understand.
expansionism.
I mean,
those are all pretty good, right?
Well, I mean, it's a model of sort of Pax Americana. I mean,
Right.
Well, yeah, the question is, what is the alternative? I don't think the history of human civilization, the terminus point is America as global hegemon.
But we're unlike other empires. We don't charge a tax. We don't meddle in the internal affairs in any meaningful sense.
Well, that's not true. I mean,
well, how do we meddle in the internal affairs? I mean, we have military installations all over the world, but we don't use that to conquer. It's not like we conquest. I mean, I understand that there are some on the left who say...
Well, there's a huge difference between those two, right? To say that we don't meddle...
I think for the most part, America's what you'd call Pax Americana, and we agree on the sort of imperial, is just generally a very benevolent thing for the world.
Right.
And it's far better than any alternative.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is what the alternative is, and that, everything is good or bad in relation to some other end state. I mean...
Right. So what are the alternatives at this point? The Russians?
No, the alternative is, and this is why, I will never be elected to office, is some sort of global governance. I mean, yes. I mean, that's, there was a time when, there was lots of little city-states in in Europe, and the only way to maintain peace in Europe was to have a Roman Empire or an Austrian-Hungarian Empire or Napoleon, and then, they realized that the peace through imperial conquest or imperial maintenance was a more tenuous and B, a sort of more degraded form of peace than peace through cooperative and collective self-governance. And,
But there's been peace in Europe under American hegemony.
Well, American hegemony may have been the enabling condition. Right. But the point is that
I never understood why the UN doesn't thank us. We're the least rapacious empire in the history of civilization. We want far less than any other empire has ever wanted. We're not even an empire. We just want free markets. We want people to buy things, and we want to buy stuff from other countries.
I think that
we don't want to own these corporations. We're happy. Our big three auto companies are now owned probably by Japanese and German auto companies. We're fine with that.
I think that's a very low standard to put ourselves to. I also think that's just a very incomplete image of the degree of policy meddling that we do in other countries. The entire legacy of structural adjustment programs in the 1990s, in which we told countries that they had to get rid of checks on their capital flows, which was a totally deranged idea, and caused.
But that was the IMF,
right? Through us,
Well, but it was the IMF though. But it was the IMF though through you can say the IMF should have had a better policy, but it wasn't just us demanding. It was sort of saying, hey, we're not going to bail out your currency. And we're not going to invest in your economy unless you do things to sort of have a more responsible economy. Now, you can say that the notion of responsibility, as Joseph Stiglitz does,
it was all
backwards. But that's not.
But it was also. Look. It was. I just see that. I think the picture that you're crafting, and I understand it as a picture so necessarily limited. It just and this actually, I think, gets to something deeply problematic about neoconservatism.
Is it neoconservative? I don't think I'm giving you a neoconservative idea. I think I'm giving you
a Kaplan-esque sort of,
Well, I don't even think it's neoconservative.
Benevolent empire.
Specifically want to use American power and use American influence to support liberal opposition groups in Iran and stuff like that. And that is a different question, or a different order of question, than just simply stating, Democrats and Republicans, liberal internationalists and neoconservatives, realists and whoever all sort of like the idea of having, all these bases around the world, and America, and sort of the idea that free trade and these sorts of things fall under the, largely, I guess, responsibility now of the American military. That we ensure that. There's a problem in Somalia right now with these pirates. Mm-hmm. Well, someone's got to go after them, right? So, someone's got to go after the pirates in Somalia. I guess, and the Navy has sort of shirked the responsibility because the Navy's got so many other things to do and it's trying to get the UN to sort of do it. But as we've seen, the UN's met on this issue, and they never get around to kind of getting the Navy because we have the biggest Navy. So someone's got to go in and bust up the pirate coves, and that's probably going to fall to us.
Right, but don't you see a sort of chicken and egg issue here? This is precisely the sort of thing that we would want some sort of international governing body to do. It's right in the wheelhouse of some sort of international governance, right?
It should. Well, I would agree with you that ultimately there should be. That's why I love, by the way, that song from the '80s, "We Are the World," USA over Africa, because I kind of agree with that. For now, we are the international community. Because the UN is anemic, and there's many reasons for its anemia, but the UN just isn't going to do that. There's a variety of reasons why it's not going to do that, because in part it has rogue-like actors that have a tremendous influence on the Security Council.
Right.
But, so I'm not saying disregard the UN. I'd like to reform the UN at some point, but for now, our force is maintaining a kind of order of things. I think everybody left and right is against piracy, right?
Sure, right, yeah.
Okay, so we're all against pirates. So someone's got to do something about pirates because, goods will be cheaper without pirates, and
right, but
we have this pirate problem. And I don't think the pirates are reacting to American hegemony.
But that's the analog there, right? Is saying everyone's against theft and then countenancing vigilantism.
But it's not vigilantism.
Well, How is it not?
Well, because we've established through custom that we are kind of we are the guarantor of the free trade.
Right. Well, sort of. I don't know. Traditionally assented to and customarily endorsed vigilantism.
Well, okay, fine, but I don't see it as the same as vigilantism because, in fact, the world there's a lot of arrangements that give us, that establish our role in this respect. I know we're a little bit off topic. I kind of like this conversation, Chris, because I don't think. I mean, it's my temperament, but I always sort of look for areas of agreement. You know what I'm saying? And I just don't. I don't see. I never understood the argument against why we shouldn't be the ones to go after the pirates,
right,
or why we shouldn't be the ones to secure, because we don't use we don't patrol the Persian Gulf in order to take a cut of all of the oil that flows from it. All we do is make sure the oil gets to China.
Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, we invaded a country so that we could have access to their we could guarantee that their oil would be within the hands of a friendly regime.
I would disagree with that reason. The reasons there were myriad reasons as why Iraq was invaded. I know that there was an argument that it was bad for Saddam to have access to oil revenues.
Sure, right. I mean, that was clearly. I mean, what was the line about if their number one export was kumquats? Do you think whose line was that?
Alan Greenspan recently came out and said,
"Oh no, but
he
Greenspan,
thought one of the reasons why we invaded was because of oil." Right. But it's a little bit deceptive in that some people on the left we've never seized the oil fields and we don't have an East India Company.
Sure, right. No, we have a different model of it's a different model.
I don't how is that that's not the same. That's categorically different. We don't own the oil. We don't make any presumption to the oil. We want to be encouraged an oil law to share the oil revenues with all the Iraqis.
We have been lobbying and putting tremendous pressure into how the internal oil law of Iraq is shaped. B, we tried to privatize. We wanted to. The plan was to privatize the oil fields immediately, and there was an immediate recognition that it would cause absolute, total political backlash and chaos. I mean,
no, I don't know. We've wanted at least in the hydrocarbon law for the last 2 years. Finally, the oil ministry to sort of relent and allow for the revenues of the oil to be shared like Alaska. How is that imperialist? We want the oil. We want the profits of the oil of Iraqi oil to go to Iraqis.
No, we don't want that. We're
like a reggae song, like that Jimmy Cliff song.
We've been forced to accept that.
Jamaicans for the Jamaicans.
What's that, Jamaica?
Iraqis for the Iraqis. I mean, yeah.
I think that we have different interpretations of the political economy of the oil law.
I just think that largely at the end of the day, the reasons for invading Iraq were because we thought that Saddam had significant links to terrorism and could, in the future, share his weapons of mass destruction that he was developing with terrorists. And that was not a sort of... that people really did fundamentally believe those two tenets, although it was not true that... at least the CIA didn't believe that Saddam did 9/11 or anything like that. But Cheney believed that. But that was not... So that was not... There was a difference between those two thoughts. But there was a belief that it was sort of Iraq was a risk, and Spain under Aznar and Tony Blair's the UK, and there were a lot of people who agreed that Saddam was sort of a risk, and there was also these 17 other UN Security Council resolutions based on the original ceasefire of the '91 Gulf War. Yeah,
I mean, I guess the broad point here, right, is that I think we have. And part of it, I think, deals with the conceptions of the possible. But
right.
I think that to me, benevolent imperial, benevolent, which I think there's some controversy about whether that's a fair adjective, but conceding that for the moment, benevolent empire to me is preferable to genocidal and rapacious empire, in the way that enlightened despotism is preferable to totalitarian oppression. But
I just think okay. But I don't think what's the alternative? Do you think the UN's ready to
but it will
take over the U.S. Navy?
No, but it won't ever be ready if we say that if we take the posture that as opposed to attempting to use whatever leverage and power we have and put it into the investing that capital in the institutional growth of the UN to be able to fulfill a role like policing international waters, which seems like just a no-brainer for some sort of international governing authority. That if at every juncture it is our judgment that expediency demands our use of force unilaterally, then of course the day will never come when, the UN or any other international institution has the capacity.
Well, we have a great example with the Somali pirates, because the first reaction of the Bush administration and the first reaction was this UN committee on
piracy.
The area, they should handle it.
Right.
It should be all of our navies combined,
right.
which is a quaint notion given the fact that our navy is so much bigger than
right.
every other navy.
Right.
Nothing has come. In fact, the piracy problem has gotten worse. And I guess let me put it like this: I am not one of these people who fears black helicopters.
Right.
And I am not sympathetic to the argument that some conservatives make about sovereignty and the UN.
No, you're making an argument about effectiveness, about it.
Well, I think an international system is absolutely necessary in a lot of respects. We could use a functioning international system to monitor elections and wipe out the last remnants of wild polio, and there's all kinds of things that we need an international system to do. It's just that the international system right now affords sovereign equality to states that seek to undermine the international system.
Right.
And I've always been frustrated with progressives who've kind of failed to see how dangerous that could be, Chris. I mean, that you don't think that. I mean, like, do you think? Let me put it like this: do you think the Islamic Republic of Iran has any interest in participating in the international system, or for that matter, today, really, we have to say China and Russia as well, sadly, who support far worse policies that are just clearly negatively in their own interest. I mean, like China's entire Sudan policy is really rapacious imperialism. That's just like, we don't care if there's a genocide as long as we get the oil from the Greater Nile Corporation. So my question is, how do you get an international system that includes everybody? Because it's important to have the buy-in from all these states if you have certain states that have clearly there kind of to undermine. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a hard question. Yeah, I mean, if I had the answer to that, that would be. I mean, but I also think that part of the first step of getting to some point where that would be possible is some self-critical awareness of the way the U.S. itself acts. I mean, I think that there's just this category distinction in your mind and in the minds of a lot of sort of your ideological brethren that is sort of deeply rooted in this kind of exceptionalist ideal. I do think America as an international actor and its history is distinct and unique in all sorts of interesting and important ways. Yeah. But I also think that there's a lack of self-awareness that makes it very difficult to begin to forge that kind of. I mean, obviously this is the issue, right? I mean, this is the thing that has been so that we saw made manifest in the last 8 years is this the notion that it's antinomianism insofar as if we do it, then it therefore is righteous because we are righteous. Like, to the righteous, all things are allowed. I mean, that's
well. Okay, let me put it like this. I obviously have changed a lot of my views because of the Iraq War. I've been to Iraq for 2 extended tours, so I'm not going to defend everything from the beginning. But let me put it like this. I always thought that somewhere lost in the kind of backlash on the Iraq War was the notion that Saddam was an absolute menace, not just to his own people, but the entire region. Right. And that people who were serious about human rights, who were by no means conservatives, like Hanya Mufti of Human Rights Watch, supported that invasion because they really understood how exceptionally evil Saddam was and how Iraq had kind of fallen into the ward of the international community, and the international community was a kind of unwilling in ways to act. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't want to get... I mean, it's hard to have this conversation now because it's still very frayed nerves. Mm-hmm. But at least there were quite a few liberals who supported the Iraq War, not because they
No, of course not. We know
not for corrupt reasons, because they really saw how bad Saddam was.
That's right, and I think that this returns to this point of just how important, means and instruments are, and that they've been chastened. I think there's, and that's why, and that actually brings us nicely, I think, roundly around to exactly why the realists have sort of assumed such prominence, because.
Right. And by the way, neocons should not be celebrating the rise of the realists, because the realists were the people that the neocons have been fighting since Reagan. Right,
of course. But I think part of here's what I want to get at, actually. So here, I'm trying to articulate this, and I think, sorry, I'm just thinking.
Okay.
There's this sort of, I guess, my point, the point that I want to make is that one of the most profound miscalculations for, let's say, the most pure of heart neocon or liberal hawk, right? Someone who actually, in their heart of hearts, bare open their soul, wasn't trying to get oil, wasn't trying, was really motivated by the kind of concerns you're talking about.
Right.
Was a projection of their own good intent onto the apparatus of the state. And such a projection, I think, is it's dangerous and also impossible. That a state doesn't that the implementation of something as horrific and monumental as war, that it is implemented by do-gooder liberal internationalists or whatever, that a recognition that that states go to war. As soon as you go to war, you're going to war for a whole set of interests that can run the gamut of, what I mean, of intentions.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Wolfowitz famously said that the human rights issue was not enough to justify the invasion, and therefore you had to justify it in other terms. And I mean, I guess, I don't know. I don't think that the state is such or the U.S. military is such an awful institution in that respect. Certainly, there's been awful. I mean, the Abu Ghraib scandal is something that nobody can defend. But it doesn't really compare. I mean, I don't know. It's I think largely. I saw when I was in Iraq last, U.S. military advisors, training people on interrogations that were making them more.
Sure. No, I'm sure that. Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure that's the case.
Sometimes, I think in Plan Colombia, like I interviewed Rand Beers, and Rand Beers, who I guess is staffing on Homeland Security, talked about how U.S. engagement of Colombian military in Plan Colombia has made the Colombian military more humane. So sometimes U.S. involvement in these sorts of things can have beneficial effects in that respect. But I see your point about how, you want to look at the best sort of outcomes or the best intentions, and yet there's a whole series of motivations as to why states go to war
that are just unavoidable. I mean, states don't go to war. I think as a general, there are exceptions to every rule, but I think as a fairly ironclad rule, the history of human civilization, that states do not go to war out of altruism. I mean, I just think that's.
Yeah.
I think that's.
Yeah, there's something to that.
I think so.
I mean, as an ironclad rule, but listen. I've been saying this for years, but we have a volunteer military. Mm-hmm. If anything, what we learned in Iraq is that unless what we learned in Iraq was, I think that we're incapable of these kinds of long-term. I don't think we can have Western armies imposing democracy, because I don't think Western advanced democracies can stomach what may be required to do the long slog work of counterinsurgency. Period.
Right.
I mean, just in the modern media age, it's too hard.
Okay.
So, no, I'm serious. I mean,
there's a moral dimension. I mean, there's that article in Harper's, the counterinsurgency as military malpractice or whatever the. Do you remember that piece? I mean, it basically said, look, there is a way to successfully win an occupation, and it's to make the cost of collaborating with the insurgents prohibitively high, and all sorts of occupying armies figured this out, and it means,
Yes, no, exactly, right. Advanced democracies. Well, let me put it like this: there's some conservatives who argue, and I disagree with them, that we need a coarsening of the American soul in order to stomach the necessary grit and work of longer military occupations. I am not one of those people. I think that there's probably, what we learned is that we can, with fewer troops, work and train local actors. In some cases, they would be training in some ways, I guess, insurgents in areas where Al-Qaeda controlled, the territory. That we want to find partners who will go up against, what I would call sort of the wider swath of Islamic supremacism.
Right. That's
very different mission than, gearing up one day for invading again. Now, I'm not privy to the innermost thoughts of the neoconservative cabal, but my sense of is, I'm in my 30s, I guess. My sense of, I don't know anybody who's gearing up who thinks that we can invade a country for a generation.
Right.
I just think invasions are now not on the table. So once you sort of say, you know what, there's not really much of a policy option to invade a country unless extraordinary circumstances. Sure. But just there's once you kind of put that out of the thing, I would hope that liberals and progressives would understand that, well, we need to do something to approach the problem of sort of the pirate coves of terrorism, if you will.
Right.
And maybe we can do it by, because in a lot of cases, the locals do not want to live under such an ascetic system. One of the things we learned when we went into Afghanistan, especially, is that Afghans did not want to live under the Taliban.
Right.
So if we could figure out a way of liberating countries that have to live under the Taliban in the future without invading them,
right,
which is possible, I think, then I would think you would have a right-left consensus on that. And hopefully one, because I think the realist inclination is to want to cut a deal with the Taliban in the end of the day, because it just assumes the Taliban has the same national interests as anybody else. And as long as they don't, and that would be unacceptable for me and you, I think, for many of the same reasons, right?
Yeah, I think so. Although I find my thinking on this is incredibly conflicted and muddled. I mean, I think...
Yeah. By the way, Chris, you're the Washington editor of The Nation. You are in a very important position for progressives, and I am not detecting from you any of the kind of academic anti-Americanism or reflexive anti-Americanism that I would find in when I go to Z Magazine or other far left journals.
My feeling on this is that, which is something that I've said to many people in Europe, is that the problem is not America. The problem is a surfeit of power. I mean, I don't think there's something. I think there's a mirror image of American exceptionalism that I don't know how many people actually share this, but some people on the left have a kind of mirror image of American exceptionalism, and I think it's actually it's quite widely shared in a lot of other parts of the world, which is the mirror image of American exceptionalism is like America is exceptionally bad, is like exceptionally nefarious, exceptionally...
Well, have you read Howard Zinn's book?
I've read People's History and I've read some others, but I haven't read...
Yeah, right.
But...
Well, I'm just saying, Howard Zinn is of the...
I don't know if that's true, though. I think that, my feeling is that both versions of American exceptionalism are flawed, and that America is a nation that has a lot of, is a global hegemon, and if you were to spin some kind of Wheel of Fortune wheel and choose another country at random to be a global hegemon, or if you look through history at other countries that have been global hegemons, they've acted in similar ways, and that the things that are bad that we on the left criticize about American foreign policy are largely outgrowths not of some particular sin or disease in the American polity or consciousness, but outgrowths largely of the objective conditions of power.
Don't you think, though, that something that is exceptional and different about America than any other great power is that we're a nation that really has, as evidenced by the election of Barack Obama, we really have absorbed the world's cultures in a way that, granted, yes, we destroyed the tribes of Native America.
But don't you think, I actually think that's actually a through line for global hegemons often. I think...
you think, like, Rome absorbed, like, all the...
Yeah.
To a degree, but
Britain
I just think
did
it was
in a lot of ways.
I think America is sort of one of the... all the rest of the world wants to come to America, and we've been able to kind of, at least culturally, create and then project through our mass media something very unique. It's something that is a synthesis,
Right.
a stew
Right.
of kind of global influences.
No, I agree, and I think that's
why everybody wants to be like us, and that's why I think our greatest power is in our movies and our culture.
yes, our top 40, particularly.
Well, no, and we will literally steal away your children because they want to be like us.
No, I know that
Right.
that is true. I mean, I don't think I have a particularly thorough or thoughtful understanding of that particular phenomenon, but I definitely
But I just always thought that would made us a little bit different. And also, we are now the world's oldest modern democracy, obviously.
Sure, right.
And there is a strain from the very beginning of the country where we viewed the sort of aspirations, or rather I should say it's a debate, but there's always been an American movement that sort of, we view the aspirations of people seeking freedom and self-determination anywhere in the world as sort of akin to our struggle as well.
Right.
Which is something that at least, the French Empire and the British Empire and the Roman Empire, they were interested in like kind of, the greater riches and glory of Rome or
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, or Britain. Whereas we really, I think, have this view that, we do care about other countries, and we also don't have the same...
I have to say, this is I think if you went back and talked to the Brits, they would have said the same thing. I think the Romans would have said the same thing. I think that every global hegemon, every empire tells itself that story. Now, it could be the case. I am not discounting the possibility that it is the case that is really true about us and wasn't true about the others. But I think it's...
But we never owned, like, this is the other big difference is that we don't have any claim... I mean, I guess we owned the Philippines, right? And we I mean, I guess there are very few examples, but we never had, like, an empire in the way that the British did. We never owned, like, an India.
No. Well, no one really had an empire.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, in the Cold War, we had our strongmen, we had our sons of bitches, and they, but it was always important for us that it was like that was their policy. We never did it openly. And then after the Cold War, we encouraged the transition from dictatorship to democracy in the Western Hemisphere, and we largely succeeded, except for Hugo Chavez and the Castro, who for some reason Sean Penn in the cover of your magazine is excited about talking.
Hugo Chavez and Castro are not the same in terms of the mechanisms by which they became leaders of their country. It should be noted.
Yeah, no, it's true, but Hugo Chavez has encroached upon any kind of political opposition. Which I read the cover story, and by the way, I had an evening once with Sean Penn and Christopher Hitchens. A wild, boozy evening.
I'm sure it was.
Right.
Yeah. Look, we're not going to. I
Right.
think we're not going to settle.
We really did. We covered the waterfront.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it very much.
I did too, Eli, and I want to allow the fine procrastinating audience members who need to finish their lunch hour while watching this time to go back and be productive members of their organization. So,
okay.
Yeah. Well, let's do it again.
Au revoir.
Let's do it again.
Absolutely. Shalom.
All right. You too.
Okay.
Bye, Eli.
Bye.